With Stan Bowman now at the helm of the Edmonton Oilers, many people are curious. Is he going to do a good or a bad job?
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I'm your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everybody who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Now that the playoffs are over, the sports stop sportsing like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So today's episode went back. I looked. Every single trade Stan Bowman made as general manager of the Chicago Blackhawks. We're not going to talk about all of them, because a good chunk of them are pretty inconsequential. Mid-round pick for late-round pick, roster player for roster player, prospect, AHL guy for AHL guy. The vast majority of his trades, and I'll click over to my notes here because I did the math, 40% of the trades are pretty inconsequential. Guys with less than 100 games traded for each other, picks traded for other picks that didn't turn into anything for either team. But one thing that is worth talking about when we're doing this at the outset, the opening segment, we're going to just talk about evaluating these trades, being able to use context to both historical context of the move at the time and then the benefit of hindsight, because of course, now that you know how some of these guys' careers turned out, you can have a more accurate evaluation of a trade. And some of these trades, you're going to say, well, Nick, you're being a little harsh. That they had to do that for salary reasons. And yeah, there are quite a few trades in the loser column of this episode that are straight up salary dumps, where the Blackhawks did not get anything quality in return and instead ended up just giving away a good player. And there are some of these salary dumps that are a little more favorable because you were able to turn a guy who didn't turn out to be anything into a draft pick that was decent. You know, the one I'll shout out now is Scott Darling, who had a decent run as a backup goalie to Corey Crawford, and the Blackhawks were able to turn him into a third-round pick. But at the outset, you need to understand that when Stan Bowman assumes the Blackhawks job in the summer of 2009, that's a team coming off of a playoff run that's got the core pieces in place. You've got Kane, you've got Taves, you've got Duncan Keith. You don't have Corey Crawford yet, but you do have Dustin Byfuglien. You've got a nice foundation of guys to build out around. And then over the extended period of time, you've got the highs. You've got the 3 Stanley Cups in 5 years. They have the really good season and the lockout shortened year, the one where it's only like 44, 43 games, whatever it was, 2012, 13, but all the games were in 2013. The Blackhawks have a really good season that year. 14, they lose to the Kings in the conference final in a game 7. Very easily could have been back in the Cup final for a second straight year or the third time in 4 years. They end up going back the following season. They make trades for Antoine Vermette. They bring in Brad Richards as a free agent. They get there. They get over the hump. They win that Stanley Cup against that Tampa Bay team. That's a little early. You know, that's early stages of Kucherov, Palat. Points very obviously not there. Ben Bishop is the starting goalie, not Andrei Vasilevsky. It's a tier below what the Lightning were ultimately able to become. But the way I have chosen to evaluate a lot of these trades is a marriage of the two contexts of the present day of where we are in 2024 and that in August, and the context of the trade at the time. Because in hindsight, you have information that they did not have at the moment. You can determine who won a trade. 10 years later, you can determine who won a trade. Now, don't go evaluating trades that happened 6 weeks ago. Any trades that happened at the draft, this past deadline, last year's deadline even, you got to give it some time. Unless it's unequivocal. The Rangers burning a second-round pick and a conditional pick on Patrick Kane, who had one hip to play 12 games, that you can chalk up as a loss. But some of the trades you're not going to be able to determine for an extended period of time. You could look at that Timo Meier trade at last year's deadline from Sharks to the Devils, where in a vacuum, the Devils very clearly got a quality hockey player for not a ton of value, a first round pick, a draft pick, and a roster player or two. They didn't have to give up a whole lot for somebody who's been one of the best power forwards in the NHL over the last 5 years, but you can't determine who wins that trade because you need to see what the guys the Sharks got turned into, and you need to see how Timo Meier acclimates. And I know I've spent a good chunk of this first segment just talking about theory and haven't really tied it to the Blackhawks yet, but I promise this is getting there before we actually start talking about the trades themselves in the following two segments. But context in these trades is what matters. Is this a general manager who thinks his team is right there on the line and we push a few more chips in? Maybe we break through and we win the Stanley Cup. Is this a general manager that's we need to just get in the playoffs and then anything can happen? Is this a general manager that's, okay, I'm desperate, I need to make this trade to try and save my job, like some of the trades we're going to talk about here? The list is numerous. I am not going to go through all 116 trades. I do not have that much. 106 trades, excuse me. 106 trades over 11 seasons. That averages out to about 9.5 trades per season. A recurring theme in Stan Bowman's tenure in Chicago is trading away guys only to trade for them back. You can mention Brandon Saad multiple times, Andrew Shaw, Marcus Kruger, Christopher Stieg, guys that the Blackhawks had, they traded and then reacquired from other organizations. And some of those trades, not great, reacquiring Andrew Shaw, giving away multiple draft picks for a player who is very clearly on his last legs in the NHL, not the best. Giving up Artemi Panarin to reacquire Brendan Saad, but we'll get there when we get there. We're not there yet. But the recurring themes in these trades, the vast majority of them, as I said, they're not particularly consequential. These are fringe NHL guys for fringe NHL guys, AHL guys, depth, the types of trades that no one's losing sleep over. But as you break it down, and I'm going to click back over to my notes here, I categorized the trade percentage as follows. 39.2% of these trades are whatevers, fringe NHLer for fringe NHLer or draft pick for draft pick, and the picks didn't turn into anything. The next biggest category I have bad at 22%. I have fine at 18%. I have good at 16%. I have horrendous at 2.8%. And then I have steals at 0.01%. So to give you some perspective, that would put I want to do this exercise for every NHL general manager, but I think that would take like a week worth of research to do. So I don't know if I can promise you that episode anytime soon. That's going to require quite the deep dive. And especially without Cap Friendly now, it's a little bit harder to develop these, to ascertain all of this information without really having to get into the nuts and bolts of Googling every player year over year. So once I can find an efficient way of doing this research, I probably will end up ranking all the GMs based on their trade histories. But for the purposes of this exercise and evaluating Stan Bowman, the vast majority, 40%, I shouldn't say majority, plurality, the plurality of these trades are inconsequential. A good chunk of them are bad. A good chunk of them are whatever. Some are good. A few are atrocious. And one is amazing. So that gives you a reasonable visual in your head of what we're working with. 40, 20, 20, 10, 15, and then like 5, and then like 6. Less than 1%. So with that in mind, we're going to take our first break. We're going to come back, and then we're going to start tackling some of these trades. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. I love sports. I love them so much, I never want them to stop. But now that the playoffs are over, we have fewer games. And sports are not sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I am in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. If you were curious, the Oilers still sitting as the betting favorite to win the Stanley Cup next year at 8.5 to 1. The Florida Panthers, if you think they're going to go back-to-back, 10 to 1. The Devils, Avalanche, and Stars are all at 11 to 1. The Vegas Golden Knights and Carolina Hurricanes are at 14 to 1. The Maple Leafs and Rangers, 15 to 1. If you like Steven Stamkos and the new look Nashville Predators, 16 to 1. Long shots, I got you a long shot. The Vancouver Canucks, 23 to 1 to take home the Stanley Cup for their first time in that franchise's history. So if you want to get in on the action, head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insight on every team in the league. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay, so let's get to the nuts and bolts of today's episode. Looking at my list, I will start with the bad. We'll get to the horrendous, but bad are contextual. So the first one, and this one stinks because obviously this is a salary issue. The Blackhawks could not afford to keep Dustin Byfuglien on that team. They had to trade him to the then Atlanta Thrashers, who would become the Winnipeg Jets eventually. But they did get a first-round pick in return. Unfortunately, that first-round pick did not eventually become anything of consequence. Dustin Byfuglien played in the NHL for about another 9 years. He retired before that 2020 season where things kind of got weird. But you play a player who plays as a first-pair defenseman with offensive upside, as a right-handed shot, has a little bit of nastiness to his game, was one of the focal points of that Jets franchise when they went back to Winnipeg. Clearly somebody that if the Blackhawks could have made the money work, it would have been awesome for him to be able to figure out the rest of his career. You know, that's one of those real sliding doors moments. If the Blackhawks could figure out a way to afford to keep Dustin Byfuglien long-term, and then you don't have to go and make some of the other trades you do, and you're rolling with, you also have the real conundrum of, is Dustin Byfuglien going to play forward or is he going to play D? Because in my head, I was going to be like, wow, imagine what a Duncan Keith, Dustin Byfuglien, or Nick Hjalmarsson and Dustin Byfuglien, or Johnny Oduya, what any of those guys with Byfuglien would have looked like over an extended period of time. Then in my head, I had to remind myself, oh yeah, that's right. When he was with the Blackhawks, he was still playing forward for a good chunk of that time. So that's one to keep in mind. This one, you can accuse me of recency bias, but trading a draft pick that became Brock Nelson for 2 second-round picks as a trade back on draft night, I understand trading back, especially as a Stanley Cup contender. You can never have enough draft picks, and when you're picking in the back half of rounds, you're going to want as many picks as you can get because you're usually going to need to trade those picks at deadlines, whatever. Brock Nelson's one of the most consistent players in the league. He's had a really nice late career renaissance into his early 30s where he's consistently flirted with 30, 35 goals. He's going to probably be the Islanders' second line center this year. He's been a first or a second line center for most of the last 5 to 10 years. He's a quality player. He's a leader, somebody that the Blackhawks very much could have used. You go back and look through their history after they start winding back that position of being a Stanley Cup contender. You see Brad Richards, you see Artem Anisimov. They really kind of struggled to find that second center to go behind Jonathan Toews. That's one that comes to mind. Trading a second for Jimmy Hayes, somebody who they subsequently traded later on. Trading second-round picks for guys who don't have a big track record without a plan of how to turn them into a player is questionable. Trading Andrew Ladd for a second-round pick, somebody who, trading Andrew Ladd for a second-round pick. I know that seems a bit harsh, but Andrew Ladd still had useful hockey left in him when they traded him this first time. And then down the road, they paid a fee to subsequently reacquire him. Trading Brian Campbell for a player who did not make the NHL for a extended period of time. Brian Campbell played another 7 seasons in the NHL after trading him. Trading Nick Leddy in a straight-up salary dump to the Islanders for 3 players who had less than 100 career combined games at the NHL level. Trading a first for Antoine Vermette. Yes, they did go on to win the Stanley Cup in 2015, but Antoine Vermette was not a top 6 forward. That was a product of the Blackhawks being able to do salary cap shenanigans because Patrick Kane was on injured reserve. Trading Antti Raanta for Joe Haggerty. Antti Raanta has been a really solid tandem goalie pretty much his entire NHL career. And you think about how much that would have benefited the Blackhawks to have a true backup to Corey Crawford. But again, that's more of a salary dump. Trading Chris Versteeg for a player who has less than 100 NHL games played. Trading Trevor Daley for Rob Scuderi. Trading a first-round pick to get back Andrew Ladd, who you gave up a second to acquire in the first place. That seems counterintuitive. Trading Teuvo Teravainen in a salary dump for just a third-round pick. Trading Ryan Hartman for a first-round pick. And that one you might want to put in the fine column because getting a first-round pick for somebody like Hartman who's been very inconsistent. It does seem like that 137, 38 goal season he had with Minnesota is an extreme outlier. But getting a first round pick for a guy you very much could have used seems counterintuitive. The Blackhawks were very much still trying to be a playoff team, a Stanley Cup contender when they traded away Ryan Hartman. That's a player that needed more opportunity. And that's something we did talk about earlier in the summer when the Oilers first hired Stan Bowman was guys like Ryan Hartman, guys like Gustav Forsling. There are other players. Philip Deneau was the third guy I was trying to think of, who very much could have filled a useful role for the Blackhawks, but for whatever reason, they weren't inclined to give those guys run to be able to figure it out. Trading Nick Schmaltz for Dylan Strome. Nick Schmaltz is still a very solid NHL defenseman, and they didn't get anything out of Dylan Strome. I like Dylan Strome. I think he's found a good spot for himself in Washington, where he's going to be a second or a third line center, but Nick Schmaltz has been a first-pair defenseman, and some of that is being on Arizona, who's not a great team. Trading Jan Ruda for Slater Cuckoo. Slater Cuckoo's a little bit different. He had off-the-ice stuff. He has mental illness that really bothered him. He retired from hockey very young. So that one I might be being a bit harsh on. But Jan Ruda, that's another useful NHL defenseman the Blackhawks traded away for someone who did not eventually pan out. Trading Gus Forsling for Calvin DeHaan. Gus Forsling has had a massive emergence, and some of that is the benefit of playing in Florida on a good team. Multiple teams messed up Forsling's development. Acquiring a second-round pick for Andrew Shaw. Trading Andrew Shaw for a second-round pick. Why are you giving up a second-round pick for Andrew Shaw? Because of familiarity. Trading Henry Jokiharju for Alex Nylander. Jokiharju is a solid defenseman for the Sabres. Trading Brandon Saad for Nikita Zadorov. I mean, I think Zadorov is better now, but at the time, Saad was very clearly a good player, and he went on to win another Stanley Cup with Colorado. Would have been nice to have him. Trading Matthias Janmark for Nick DeSimone, somebody who the Blackhawks traded less than 12 months later. Matthias Janmark, not a world beater, but a useful, functional NHL fourth liner the Blackhawks very much could have used at some point in the last 4 years. And then the Seth Jones trade. I don't have Seth Jones in horrendous because Seth Jones does still have some time on that contract, and he's very much kind of eating it, being overworked and overpaid defenseman on a bad team, which it's a difficult rap, and it's hard to distill out just how much is him being not as good as people thought he was versus the environment being brutal. And then trading Phil Deneau for Dale Weiss, that's in the horrendous category. I mean, Phil Deneau is one of the best two-way centers in the entire NHL, and Dale Weiss was out of the NHL pretty quickly after this trade. And then trading Artemi Panarin for Brandon Saad. That theme of going back to reacquire guys from the glory days is why the Blackhawks window accelerated in closing. They burned a lot of assets trying to get familiar faces. They closed their window faster with a lot of these trades. Turning Panarin into Saad undoubtedly hindered their ability to maintain a serious level of competitiveness. You don't know what the Blackhawks look like if their second line is Artemi Panarin and Patrick Kane through the late 2020s. And instead, they trade Panarin to Columbus. Columbus finally has that breakthrough where they beat Tampa Bay in the first round. And the Blackhawks, very stubbornly to the end, Seth Jones, Marc-Andre Fleury, who we haven't gotten to yet, just not recognizing that their window was closing and costing them. If they recognized their window was closing, they could have been in a better position to set themselves up for long term, as opposed to needing to be god awful for 3 or 4 years. And yes, they did ultimately get rewarded with Connor Bedard. They're going to end up being in a reasonable position where they won't be the worst team in hockey this year. But if you have to lie to yourself to continue saying, oh, we're Stanley Cup contenders, you're not doing your job well. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about some of the good trades, some final thoughts, and get out of here. I'll be right back. We are all driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for candidates isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform. Over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster, 93% of employers agree. Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to recent Indeed surveys. Indeed leverages over 140 million unique qualifications and preferences every day. Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences. So the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Thank you to everybody who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. If you're watching on YouTube and you see the bags under my eyes, I was at Green Day last night. Very fun concert, but my goodness, did I get home late? I did not sleep well. I am a tired person on this Tuesday, but I thought this was an interesting topic. I was talking about it with one of my friends at the show last night who was taking more of an interest in the Oilers because doing the show and said, well, was Bowman actually that as bad as everyone says he was? And I was like, I think so, but let me go back on the record and look, and we'll talk about the asset management and like the free agency and the long-term contracts that Bowman ultimately agreed to in Chicago at some point later in the week. I feel like that's a good topic to marry to the trades. But as far as the good, the fine, the great, trading Chris Versteeg and turning him into Victor Stallberg, that's a win. Trading Hugh Jessman, who's a fringe NHLer, was like a top, I want to say like an 8th overall pick of the Rangers back in like 1998 for Michael Frolik, that's a good trade. Turning John Scott into a 5th round pick, that's a good trade. Turning Frolik into a 3rd round pick, that's a good trade. Turning Jimmy Hayes into Chris Versteeg, that's a good trade. Turning Brandon Bolig into a 3rd round pick. Turning Brandon Saad into Artem Anisimov, and that one, hear me out. The Blackhawks needed a center. They needed a second-line center. They had too many wingers. I understand the apprehension to that idea that, hey, positional value, center's more important. I understand people who are a little apprehensive of that would say, I'd rather have the best player. I'd rather have the best player. Anisimov had a few solid seasons with Chicago. Ideally, you would have liked to have kept Brandon Saad so you didn't have to trade Panarin to go back and get him. But I don't mind that trade as much as some other people do. Turning Trevor Daley into Patrick Sharp. That is a really good trade. Patrick Sharp had a really solid run with the Blackhawks both times. Turning a 4th round pick into Johnny Oduya. Johnny Oduya, one of the more underrated middle pairing defensemen of the 2010s. Really defensive oriented, really solid. Turning Scott Darling into a 3rd round pick. That's a really good trade. Turning turning Nick Hjalmarsson into Connor Murphy. That's fine. Nick Hjalmarsson was pretty close to the end of the road. Did not have a ton of hockey left in him. Trading Michael Kempny for a 3rd round pick. Michael Kempny is a 7th defenseman. You turned him into a 3rd round pick. Great. Turning Tommy Wingles into a 5th round pick. That's great. Turning Eric Gustafsson into a 3rd round pick. That's great. Turning Malcolm Subban into Robin Lehner. That is great. Turning something Sakura into Brandon Peary. Brandon Peary is somebody that other teams valued and they were able to make other things happen. Turning Nikita Zadorov into a 3rd round pick. That is solid. Turning a 2nd round pick into the 2nd round pick that became Brandon Saad. That is good trading. Turning Troy Brouwer into the 1st round pick that became Philip Deneau. That is a good trade. Turning a 2nd and a 3rd round pick into Johnny Oduya. That is a good trade. Turning a 4th into Michael Handzus. That's a good trade. Turning Dave Bolin into a 2nd and other picks. That's a good trade. Turning a 4th into Pierre-Eric Bouchard. That is a good trade. Turning Brandon Peary into a 3rd and a 5th round pick. That is a good trade. Turning Adam Glendening into Gus Forsling. It would be in the steal category if the Blackhawks actually gave Gus Forsling a chance to figure it out. Turning Philip Morin into Richard Panik. That's a good trade. Turning Andrew Shaw into a 2nd round pick. That's a good trade. Turning Richard Panik into Anthony Duclair. That's a good trade. Turning Brandon Manning into Drake Caggiula. That is a good trade. Turning Dominic Kahn into Oli Mata. That is a good trade. Turning Nick DeSimone into a 2nd round pick. Nick DeSimone has been on waivers like 3 times in the last 5 years, and you got a 2nd round pick out of him. And this one, as an Oilers podcast, this one should irk you. He turned 39-year-old Duncan Keith into a 3rd round pick with no salary retention. He turned Brent Seabrook's dead money into a second-round pick. The Blackhawks ate Tyler Johnson's money, but I digress. And then turning future considerations into Marc-Andre Fleury. The trades in the good column are really, really solid moves. And a lot of those guys have the benefit of being on Stanley Cup teams. So it's hard to distill out just how important Chris Versteeg is individually. But in my brain, I think of him as being on a Stanley Cup team. So he must have been pretty useful. In the steal category, they got Nick Leddy for a guy who has less than 100 career NHL games. Nick Leddy's got 1,000 games in the NHL, really good on the Islanders, really good on the Blackhawks. You got to think about that Blackhawks decor over the years, man. You talk about Keith, Seabrook, Hjalmarsson, Oduya, Trevor Daley, Nick Leddy. They really had a lot of quality defensemen over the years. And it really was kind of the driving force of their window. And Nick Hjalmarsson is extremely underrated in the context of the last 5 to 10 years and an essential component to their success. Utterly essential to have a guy like Hjalmarsson who could play behind Keith and Seabrook, where in 2013, when they won the Stanley Cup, they were playing Kimmo Timonen like 11 minutes a game as their sixth defenseman because they didn't trust him out there. It was kind of the same boat as you see teams do with like what the Stars did with Nils Lundqvist, where we don't trust him to make plays out there when the game is tight, so we're going to run Duncan Keith 33 minutes a night. That's the type of move that it worked out well for them at being able to get Nick Leddy for as little as they did. But I hope this information gives you a bit more color. I have been very critical of the Stan Bowman hire from hockey reasons and for person reasons, and I think I've laid out a reasonable case as to why you should be skeptical of his hockey management decisions. But I also want to be fair to the evidence. That's why you go back and look at all 106 trades over 11 years and you be objective. You break them up into various categories of good, bad, whatever, fine, atrocious, and great. Because the more specific you can be, the more detailed you can be, it gives you a more clear picture. And that's ultimately the goal of this show. I want to give you the most accurate and actionable information possible so you can make your evaluation yourself. I like to aggregate. I like to read other people's work, listen to other podcasts, and use that as part of, well, if they think this, am I missing something in my evaluation? But it does seem like most opinion on Bowman is pretty negative from a hockey perspective, and then you get into the Brad Aldrich stuff, and it's really easy to make the case that this was a bad decision. But ultimately, from a hockey perspective, there are people who are willing to give him a second chance. And that will do it for today's edition of Locked on Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button. Please hit the alarm bell. Let me know, what do you think the best trade Stan Bowman made in Chicago was? What do you think the worst trade he made when he was in Chicago? And before we get out of here, thanks for making Locked on Oilers your first listen of the day. Now go check out the Locked on NHL podcast, where the season never ends, providing national expertise with a local perspective. You can find the link to Locked on NHL in the description, so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.